All right, so we have another Elite Heat extra video. We got quite a bit of these coming up, but we're gonna have some fun with this one. We're gonna put to rest this Kenny Omega Roman Reigns debate. This is the last time that we're gonna discuss this. You elitists have already made a video about this on your own channel, but we're coming at it with this one with a different take, a different perspective than what you did. We're not really gonna decisively say which one is better. We're just gonna look at this because the fact of the matter is Kenny Omega and Roman Reigns, whether we like it or not, they're the two faces of pro wrestling right now. Kenny Omega is the top guy in AEW. Roman Reigns is the top guy in WWE. They're both the champions, and we're really here to see like who is the more credible champion, who's the true top champion in wrestling. Because I mean, it's not Karrion Kross, no disrespect to him, and it's not Bobby Lashley, no disrespect to him, but it really is a debate between Roman and Kenny. Wouldn't you agree?
I mean, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Cross and Lashley there. I mean, for God's sakes, Kevin, Karrion Cross is literally the champion of the Indie Wrestling Federation. I mean, my God, like, we're not counting
You
Cross.
gonna steal
Lashley,
my gimmick there, bro?
I mean, you brought it up before. It's just too good. So, yeah, the Indie Wrestling Federation, that's NXT in case you haven't caught on. But no, nonetheless, Cross and Lashley are great at their own separate things. But we're not talking about them. We're talking about the Tribal Chief Roman Reigns and the Belt Collector Kenny Omega. We're going to talk about more so legacies, what they've done. We'll pick some holes in some certain things. We're going to go through it. It's going to be a good little discussion because, I mean, you mentioned the video I made on it, Kevin. My one was essentially, let's compare Reigns and Omega on the mic. Reigns wins. That's 1-0. That was my video. This one, it's completely different. We're going to settle the case once and for all. We're going to end the debate. Reigns or Omega. Kevin, let's kick us off.
Let's do it. Yeah, at the end we'll leave it up to you. We're just gonna, we're gonna just have a general discussion here. Nothing too crazy. We're not gonna get hostile. I don't know. Maybe we will. Maybe the elitists. Will, I know you're a super Kenny Omega fanboy, so you might start screaming at me
Yep.
when I say some things about him you don't like. So stay tuned for that.
I've got my Kenny Omega blow up doll, pal. I thumb that every night. But yeah, nonetheless, let's
Oh my
move. Let's move.
god. Oh, wow, I was not expecting that. Okay, so moving on. So I guess it just seems apropos to kick this off by talking about Roman Reigns. I mean, Roman Reigns. Let's look at some of the things that you have in Roman Reigns' favor. Number one, he's the top dog of the biggest company in the wrestling world, right? Like he's the top dog of the Disney of WWE. You could make the
Right.
case like, would Kenny Omega ever get to that status if he went to WWE? Like, let's just say you pluck Kenny Omega right now. You pluck him from AEW, drop him into WWE. What I would say his ceiling is probably AJ Styles. I would say that's his ceiling. Like maybe he could be a little bit better. Maybe he could get to like Kurt Angle level, someone like that. But I just don't see Kenny Omega reaching like Rock or Austin or like Cena status. What about you?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison you make. I think when it comes to mentioning Reigns as like the top guy in the Disney of wrestling, it's a good point. I think if you put Omega in that spot where Reigns is right now, especially mainly the past year of Reigns, particularly, I think does Omega do better, do worse? How does business go if Omega is the number one guy on the number one show in the number one wrestling company in the world? Does Omega do better than Reigns is as the tribal chief? I don't really think so. Now, obviously, that's a bit of a hypothetical one. But when it comes to Omega, if he was in the Disney of wrestling, WWE, where his spot is, I think Styles is a perfect way of putting it because Styles and Omega are not one and the same. Obviously, there's definite differences there, but like Omega and Styles, both well traveled indie wrestling, legacies, great, legacies in Japan. They've got plenty of similarities in that regard. Neither are the greatest promo by any means. Neither are the greatest or most over the top sports entertainer. Neither have the most over the top character. But as far as the in the ring bell to bell side of things, both are extremely good. So, Kevin, that's my take on it. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one.
Absolutely. Now to focus in on Roman because this section is about Roman. He's the top guy of WWE, and people act like generally they act like Roman's been the top guy since he returned in August of 2020. The reality and the fact of the matter here is Roman Reigns has been the top guy in WWE since I would say 2015, up at like when he won the Royal Rumble, had this feud with Brock. Because Cena, yeah, Cena's the biggest star at the time. Everyone knew Cena, but Cena was wrestling Rusev. He was wrestling Cesaro. He was wrestling guys like Dean Ambrose. in the mid card of Raw and pay-per-views. Roman Reigns has been main eventing almost every pay-per-view that he's been a hold of. He main evented, what, 4 WrestleManias, 5 WrestleManias, whatever the number is. But it didn't feel like he was the top guy. People didn't acknowledge him as the top guy until he returned in August 2020. Hence the catchphrase, acknowledge me. Is that
Right.
like,
Yeah.
do you see that? Like, do you feel people disrespected Roman Reigns' status as a top guy?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the point about Reigns not feeling like the top guy is just bang on the money, because Cena was the top guy objectively from '05 through 2014, objectively.
Right.
And then after that, like after WrestleMania 30 for the remainder of the year of 2014, it got a bit murky with it. And then 2015, WWE clearly make Reigns like the guy. He's the big dog. He's the guy who's the supposed new face of the company. But there was never that investment there. It just didn't quite click with that dynamic. So, yes, Reigns has technically been the top guy now 6 years, really, outside of the break during 2020, but 6 straight years, Reigns is the top guy, even though it only really feels like one. Because from 2015 through literally the beginning of 2020, I mean, look what happened to ratings. You know, like 5 million down to 1.7. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think that's a good look on Roman, objectively.
No, it's
But-
not. It's not. And people are acknowledging that he's becoming an all-time great. But right now, if I ask you, tell me your top 25 wrestlers of all time, any promotion, any criteria, is Roman Reigns going to even make your top 25? Is he going to make your honorable mention? Is he going to make your top 15? Like, where would you stick him in that discussion of just top 25 all time, no promotion, no any criteria, no limits?
Well, Kevin, I'll throw this back to you in a moment, but here's how I see it. So, as far as stuff that's been objectively loved, this is the kind of thing which, you know, kind of, if you have a lot of things that are objectively remembered fondly by a lot of people, your top 10. Reigns has about, 8 to 10 months of this Tribal Chief run. So he has not even a year of a really good run, and he has his stuff with the Shield. And that's because he has
and even people are poking holes at the Tribal Chief stuff. They're like a little bit tired of it.
Yes, the word stale's been thrown around. I've heard that one. So even then, the Tribal Chief thing, as great as it's been, as much as I've personally loved it, objectively speaking, there's definite holes there. And then I guess he has 4 or 5 WrestleMania main events as like the big dog. But how many of them really connected? How many of them really clicked in a positive sense?
Well, let's look at them for a second. So you have he main evented 31, 32, 33, 34, and 36. Not 36, and 37. So
Yes.
31, that was Seth Rollins' moment, one of the greatest moments of all time, the cash in. 32, it was just like, okay, can we just get the match over with? Give Roman the title. Cool, okay. 33, it would have been big if Undertaker actually stayed retired, but Undertaker came back and kind of devalued that whole main event. 34, it was literally just Brock beating up Roman, a uninterested Brock Lesnar who was just there to get a paycheck, beating up Roman for 7 minutes, and then Roman crying, holding his wife's hand. And then 37 is probably the one that people are going to remember as Roman's night, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I look at them, 31 was supposed to be 32 in the sense that was supposed to be the coronation of Roman. Roman was supposed to be the one to beat Brock and have that big moment. But because of the backlash from the 2015 Rumble, WWE made the panic knee-jerk reaction, we'll give it to Seth. We don't want 75,000 people booing to close WrestleMania. So they do that, which was an awesome moment. Reigns Lesnar at 31 was amazing. 32, a dud. 33, Undertaker was in no shape to compete. So that one's not really on Reigns. But the whole premise of Reigns is the second guy to beat Taker at Mania. Interesting, especially when the fans weren't behind Reigns really at all at that point. And then 34, you described it perfectly there. And then 37 is what we're all going to remember. So when it comes to Reigns, as a WrestleMania main eventer, at the show of shows, the thing we're going to all remember all time, 37 we're going to remember really positively. And 31, he played a role in that. That's really it.
That's where we're at. And then to tie this back and go with the top 25 question, I'll say this about it. if I'm making a top 25 wrestlers of all time list, I don't really think Roman is even in consideration to be on the list. Like, I would consider him as like an honorable mention, maybe like a top 30, 35, but he's not cracking my top 25. You know, he just not yet. And that kind of hurts his legacy because he's main evented more WrestleManias than like some of the all time greats. Like, he's main evented more WrestleManias than Stone Cold did. You know, I think. I could be wrong on that. I'm pretty sure he's main evented one more than Stone Cold. He's main
Well,
evented.
real quick, let's just fact check that real quick. Austin did 14, 15, 17, and that was it. Roman's done
He's done
31,
five.
32, 33, 34, 37. So two more than Austin.
Right. He's main evented more than Austin. He's main evented more than Brock. He's main evented more than Cena. So he's given all these accolades, but what is there to show for it? What is there to sink your teeth in when it comes to Roman Reigns? Like, when I tell you Roman Reigns, what do you think of? You know, like, I don't know. It's just for someone with all the accolades, he should be a shoe in as like a top 15 guy, but he's not even close to that level yet.
Right. Which, yeah, it's interesting when you put it that way, because like when you look at objectively his career, it's literally it's a good heel run for almost a year that people even now are calling stale, and doesn't really have that many good opponents that you can really sink your teeth into enjoying. And he was good in the Shield as the guy who wouldn't speak, and then he'd be the the powerbomb guy. Like, and is that top 25 all time to bring this back? It's not. Maybe give it 2 or 3 years of Reigns as the tribal chief on SmackDown, having feuds with guys like Cena, Edge, a Rock feud, a feud with Brock over Paul Heyman, a Jeff Hardy feud. Then, Kevin, we'd be talking about a top 25 guy, I feel like. But for the moment, I cannot say top 25. Like, I can probably name 25 better than Reigns all time easily, honestly. So
Yeah, I guess like even guys that are known notoriously as like upper mid carders, like an Edge or a Kurt Angle, who they had runs on the main event, but they're not going to be remembered as the top guys like a Cena, Batista, or Hulk. You know, even guys like them, like Edge, Orton, Kurt Angle. Even I would look at a guy like Randy Orton and still be like, yeah, he's better than Reigns. You know,
like you're valuing a guy who was built up, and their place in the company was an upper mid card type guy. You mentioned Angle, Edge, etc. You value guys like that who took the opportunities well and were successful in that more than someone who had spent literally getting towards a decade of being pushed as the top guy in the company, but it just didn't click. You know, like
right? It's like if WWE they plucked Kurt Angle from the Olympics, and in 1999 they were just like, all right, bro, you're gonna come in, you're gonna wrestle Benoit for a year, and then starting in 2001, you're gonna main event the next 4 WrestleManias because we said so. Like, that's kind of what they did with Roman. And it's not like they needed to. Like, did they really need to have Roman main event 4 straight WrestleManias? Not necessarily. You know, like they could have done Cena and Undertaker at WrestleMania 33 instead of Roman and Taker.
I literally, I mean, not to self-promote, but I literally gave a brilliant demonstration, I'd like to say, of what they could have done with this "what if CM Punk never left" thing. Roman could have main evented maybe a Mania, maybe 2. And he could have been like a silent assassin, like a Batista type character who's just cool. But instead, they made him the underdog babyface. Oh, Reigns has to go 1 versus all against 29 other people in the Royal Rumble. Oh my God, Reigns has to overcome the authority. And they push him as though he's like a 5'5" midget. And it's like, this is Roman Reigns. Why are they trying to do this? Like, this doesn't work. So, like, I think the way they pushed Reigns didn't really work. And how that links back to the rest of this video, Reigns is going to be remembered, I guess, mainly for this tribal chief stuff and all the stuff. There's like 4 years where they're pushing him down your throats as like the guy. It's almost a stain on his legacy in a way. Like,
yeah, exactly. And you know, then like we could talk about his legacy as long as we can make this whole video about Roman Reigns' legacy. But to pivot,
we'll save that for our Elite Hate bio sometime down the line. But yeah,
exactly.
Go on.
So to pivot, before we get to Kenny Omega, we have to talk about just another aspect of Roman, and that's like his in-ring ability, because it's really important. And is he a guy that's going to be remembered? Like, he did get the "you can't wrestle" stuff at first, but then it just kind of wore off. It was just like, all right, this dude it's just a carbon copy of Cena at this point. Like, we got to find another reason to hate him. Like, that's kind of what happened with it. Do you think Roman's going to be remembered as like a legendary in-ring performer?
Well, how is Cena remembered as an in-ring performer? Because I genuinely feel like Reigns is going to be remembered the same way. Because I think both of those guys are near enough smack bang on par in the ring. Cena, when he was like the top guy for all those years, would have pretty similar like good matches. Like when I think Reigns, I don't think, oh my god, think of all those god awful matches he's had. He's not like a Braun Strowman or someone like that in the ring. But when it comes to Reigns, it's like, okay, there's a bunch of good there. And nowadays he's showing that he can be great in the ring. Nowadays, every match he's having seemingly is, to use the star system, 4.5 plus stars, which is subjective, obviously, but generally speaking, Kevin, every match he's having nowadays is really good consistently. So that definitely helps him. That helps his legacy in the ring. That to Reigns is like Cena's 2015 stuff, where he's proving he can wrestle the great matches. So to answer the question, I think he's going to be remembered as a good in-ring wrestler. Obviously, he's not going to be remembered as like a Daniel Bryan or a Dolph Ziggler or a Nigel McGuinness, but he's just not going to be remembered as like a bad worker. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think when you look back at Roman and you look at him as in ring, he's going to be looked at as like a guy that I think people will always look at it and they'll give Cena more credit. Like in 5 years, people are going to be debating, oh, who's better, Cena, Reigns? Who was the better wrestler? Who was the better mic talker? Whatever. It's going to be debated. I think Reigns will be remembered kind of weirdly in the ring. Like some people look at him and be like, "Oh, he brought storytelling back to wrestling," and then the other people look at him and just be like, "Yeah, he was terrible in the ring. I hated all his matches. They were all the same. I hated them all." There's gonna be no real middle ground. I don't think. Like I don't think we're gonna get to the point when Roman retires or he goes off to Hollywood. I don't think we're gonna get to the point where people are like missing Roman the way they miss Cena. You know, like Roman, he doesn't hit the same as Cena would, and that's the best comp that we have to him. Because there really
Yeah.
is like nobody else like Roman. Because you look at all the guys, you go way back into the vault. You looking at like the mid '80s. You've got like Ultimate Warrior. Nobody remembers Ultimate Warrior as a great in ring technician. Everybody remembers the face paint, the comic book character. You look back at like you look back at like a Scott Hall. Nobody remembers Scott Hall as a great in ring worker. Scott Hall is probably mostly remembered for the stuff he did backstage. His backstage antics. So
Yeah.
and it's part of it at the NWO. So I don't really know how Roman's going to be looked at as an in-ring performer. I think it's just going to be dismissed, his in-ring career, as good as it may be right now. I just think people are going to be like, yeah, he was no Kurt Angle, he was no Daniel Bryan, he was no AJ Styles, he was no Kenny Omega. I think that's just going to be it. People are just going to dismiss him.
Yeah, I mean that sounds about right. One point I want to also make really quickly about just like the Reigns push, because I mean we talked about, yeah, Cena has this long run, and then after that, what was there? And in Cena's case, they tried with Reigns. We explained that a moment ago. I'll make a comparison to back 30 years ago. Hogan was the top guy for like 9, 10 years. And then once the Hogan stuff kind of started to fade, they pushed a guy named Lex Luger. And it was a similar type of thing of I'm the guy, I'm gonna be the franchise of the promotion. But like the Luger thing, WWE realized wasn't really working within like under a year, and they kind of fizzled that out. They're not saying that Roman Reigns or Joe Anoa'i is Lex Luger, because obviously Reigns is just better all round as a wrestler. But I think as far as how they're pushed, there's some kind of basis there. It's like Hogan, Luger, Cena, Reigns. Like
That's
I don't know, but nonetheless,
that's kind of
yeah.
what Roman would be. Like, I mean, that's kind of what Lex Luger would have been Roman Reigns before Roman Reigns. If WWE was just like, yeah, you're gonna main event the next 3 WrestleManias, Lex. But
yeah,
yeah,
you're gonna main event WrestleMania 10 and beat Yoko. You're gonna main event 11 and beat Bam Bam Bigelow. You're gonna main event WrestleMania 12. Like that's what it would have been.
right.
Like,
And people would hate Lex Luger. He'd be remembered differently. But yeah, moving on.
Yep.
Next up, Kenny Omega. When you look at Kenny Omega, he's the top guy. He's kind of like what AJ Styles was 5 years ago before he came to WWE. Just the top guy outside of WWE that never really had a run in WWE. That's kind of what Kenny Omega is now, and he's got this stellar fan base that loves him. He's a dirt sheet icon. He's got all these 7-star matches, 6.5-star matches, whatever you want to call them. But then it's like you could poke obvious holes in Kenny Omega's game and say, "Oh, he's not mainstream. Nobody knows who he is. He's not this. He's not that." It's easy to say what he's not, but what is Kenny Omega? Can you describe what is Kenny Omega? Like what he's good at and what he excels at? Can you put it into words?
Great in-ring guy who has a weird sense of humor and isn't the most naturally charismatic. That's about as objective as I can sum it up. Kevin, like you talked about him being like kind of like a Styles 5 years ago, because what they're going for at the moment isn't Styles 5 years ago. What they're going for at the moment is Kurt Angle 2007 in
Right.
TNA. That's what they're going. They're going for this whole thing where Kenny Omega is holding, God knows, in a couple of months, maybe like 5 to 6 different like world titles or like big title belts. Which it's like, okay, you're trying to make him. I mean, Kurt Angle in 07, like Kurt Angle was like the best wrestler in the world at that time. Because WWE, what was WWE when Angle was doing that? It was, I guess, Cena was holding the title like a year straight, and it was like Randy Orton standing there saying, "Hello, John." Like, it's a tough one. Like Omega, you asked a question there. What is he? I mean, good in-ring guy who has history with the Elite or something. It really, when it comes to Omega, it comes down to how much stock and how much value you put into the Elite, essentially.
Right. That's
Like,
yeah, that's I mean that's pretty well said. And I would pose the X factor with Kenny Omega too is that he's oddly famous for an independent wrestler. Like I could go out in public and I could probably find people that know who Kenny Omega is. You know?
I couldn't.
It's
Like, well, at least where you're at, especially because I mean you're from Florida, so it's probably better off. But internationally, at least where I'm at, like, I'd show 500 people Kenny Omega. Maybe one would say, "Oh, that's Kenny Omega," but that once again, that's a bit more geographical. But like, I don't know, because I showed
he's oddly famous for an international wrestling for not an international for a North American independent wrestling star. He's oddly famous. There's really been no other Kenny Omega. Like yeah, we mentioned AJ Styles, but AJ Styles was on live television on TNA for like 10 years. People knew Kenny Omega before AEW.
what.
You know,
Sorry, but what is Kenny Omega famous for? Would you say?
I think people just people just know him. You know, because New Japan has an odd fan base in North America, in some geographics, because it does go hand in hand with like anime in a lot of respects. So and video games. He's probably some people know him for that, for Street Fighter stuff. So he's oddly famous. Like there really is no other comparison for him as an indie wrestler. You can't really compare him to anyone else. You can't compare him to like, Kevin Steen from like 2013. Nobody would know who Kevin Owens is before he got called up to Raw. Nobody knew who he was in NXT. But people still, you get what I'm trying to say? Like people still know Kenny Omega. It's odd. I really can't put a finger on it. Like he's not super. I'm not saying he's super famous.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Essentially,
without the WWE backing and machine and platform, he's still carved out a name for himself. That's essentially what we're saying, and you're going for there, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. Like I wouldn't expect going into Walmart and like somebody seeing that I'm wearing a wrestling shirt and coming up to me and being like, "Are you gonna watch that AEW match? You gonna watch that Kenny Omega Chris Jericho match?" Like that's not an interaction I would be expecting to have. And I've had something similar to that happen to me where somebody asked me about this Kenny Omega match, because they were just being friendly or whatnot, and it was like I wasn't expecting it. I was like, wow, Kenny Omega's kind of famous, and like I've met people that I work with that love Kenny Omega, and I don't think there's another indie guy that has that kind of following. So he's done something, like he's built this brand for himself, where I would say he's almost larger than AEW. And he's not capitalizing on it. Like, imagine if in 2019 AEW started and it was the Kenny Omega show, when he came in off of having 5-star matches with Jericho, 6-7-star matches with Okada, and then it was just like, all right, we're gonna have Kenny Omega come in and he's gonna wrestle all these guys and have phenomenal matches. He's gonna be the best bout machine. But instead, he changed up his character. He changed up his entire presentation, and I don't know what he went for in the first year and like 3 months, 4 months of existence in AEW. You know what I mean?
Well, I think while the thought's fresh in my head, I think one of the things with Omega in AEW, and you mentioned capitalizing upon that name he has and that reputation, how AEW went about it with retrospect, was pretty off the mark. Like people went into AEW thinking, "Oh my god, Omega's an EVP. Omega's gonna be the star of the show. We're gonna get Omega Best Bout Machine Classics in the US in 2019, 2020." That's what people expected. But instead, AEW went down the rabbit hole of, okay, we're gonna do what's probably better off, I guess, for more of a mainstream audience and try and do stories and Jericho Cody and what have you. And then eventually, 2 years after AEW has been in existence, now they're finally making it like the Omega Best Bout Machine show, even though he's not really having that many like best bouts. Like he's having good matches, but it's not like, oh my god, a 45-minute classic. So how they're capitalizing upon his star power, I don't think it's been being done as well as they could possibly do, right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say. And is it a Kenny Omega thing? Is it just Kenny Omega to an American audience just doesn't work? I've heard that case, and I mean, is that a thing? I don't know. What do you think about that? Where do you stand on that side?
I mean, as far as like, does what Omega brings to the table, does that click with an American audience?
Is he better off just as a New Japan? Was he better off staying in New Japan Pro Wrestling and just having great matches?
I think this all goes back to that question you initially asked of like describe, like, what is Kenny Omega? Describe him. And the only way I can really describe him, he's a great wrestler. And that right there, that great wrestler fits like a glove with New Japan Pro Wrestling. That's what made Omega in 17, but mainly 18 especially, and then not really 19, but like 17, 18. That's what made Omega. That's what made his star skyrocket, because he was in the perfect situation. But now, when you're on mainstream North American TV and your role is to do character work, be involved in segments, cut English speaking promos to entertain an English speaking audience, and try and be an entertainer and a larger than life figure, I think there's clear gaps with that. It gets like, and so to wind that back to the initial question you asked, Kevin. Do I think he's really made for American pro wrestling? Like, I think Kenny Omega is everything he is the perfect New Japan pro wrestler. And that's what he was in 2018. But now it's like, he's he's good in mainstream North America, but I don't think he's that, like, what do you think?
I get what you mean. Yeah, like he's had great matches in AEW. He's had real good sub matches with like Ray Phoenix and Hangman Page, so on and so forth. He's had good matches, Pac especially, but he hasn't had that great match, that match that feels must see. It feels iconic. He hasn't really had that since he left New Japan, and I don't know what to blame, because like the New Japan character that we saw of Kenny Omega, it was him cutting these like real out of left field, almost Bray Wyatt like promos, not nearly that level, but cut from the same cloth. You get what I'm saying? And that now what we see in AEW is him in sunglasses looking like Brian Pillman, hanging out with the Good Brothers and the Young Bucks. There's nothing unique about him at this point. He's just a guy trying to be a sports entertainer, trying to find himself in a new situation. That's kind of where I would put him.
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, finish your thought.
And then the question becomes, can Kenny Omega get to that status? Like, can he carry AEW from a mainstream perspective? Can he be AEW's Goldberg? Like what Goldberg was to WCW? I guess that's the real question, and the verdict and the jury is still out on that, I would say.
Yeah, but at the same time, as like a follow-up question to that, how, what do you think Kenny Omega would have to do? Is it a character change thing? Is it a presentation thing? Does he have to beat different people? Like, he's already had the stuff with Jericho and Moxley and all the biggest stars, like WWE name stars in AEW. Omega's had matches with them. Like what do you think he'd have to do to take that next step, would you say?
I think one thing that would help would be getting Okada over to America and doing Okada Omega 5 on an AEW pay-per-view. That would help the case a lot. That would kind of show people like, all right, this is the Kenny Omega, this is the guy. But then that relies heavily on his New Japan legacy at the same time. So
yeah,
I don't know where you go. Like, I don't know how he gets there. I don't think I think it's a combination of things. Like, I don't think it's a Kenny Omega specific problem. Like, who is he
Yeah.
gonna face? Like you said, he's beaten everyone in AEW. Who is he gonna face? Who's that guy that's gonna push him to the next level? Because he's not a Goldberg. He's not a guy that doesn't look like everyone else. So I don't
Well,
know.
also, I think one thing you mentioned, it's kind of like almost an inherent like ceiling when you're not in the WWE and you don't have that WWE brand name. It takes a lot, and I mean WCW. You mentioned like Goldberg there. Like more like younger listeners won't really understand. They're like, oh, I hate Goldberg. He buried my favorite Kevin Owens. But back in the day, when you got Goldberg spearing Hulk Hogan in front of 45,000 people in the Georgia Dome, winning a world title, it's massive. It's like a mainstream moment. Goldberg's on the front of TV guides, magazines. It's a big deal. But especially nowadays when wrestling's more niche and Omega's in a company that's much less known than WWE, it's tough. Like what we're talking about here, he can go one of two ways. You mentioned bringing Okada in. That's going down one rabbit hole of relying upon New Japan stuff and hoping that doing the New Japan stuff on an American show and in a North American setting would help click with American fans and get him over. Or he just, I don't know, develops his character more, fine tunes out this corny, bad humor of like 69ing Don Callis and reading books to children at a preschool with Michael Nakazawa and stuff like that. You go down one or two avenues, I think. That's what I think, Kevin. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can close this conversation here.
Yeah.
You take this conversation how you will. You can take it as us burying Kenny Omega, as us praising Roman Reigns, whatever, however you want to take it. I'm fine with it either way. As long as you guys enjoyed, that's all that matters.
I don't think this was a burial or a praise of one and not the other. Like I think Reigns and Omega, to put it objectively, but there's a lot of holes in, especially with Reigns. There's a lot of holes in his like legacy when you really look at it. That's what we put under a microscope in this video. With Omega, there's not more so holes in his legacy, but holes with his like what he's doing right now. You know, so like Omega's got a supposedly like great legacy and a great history in Japan, but right now there's like a bunch of question marks. Reigns right now, everyone's praising it and it's just consensus really good, and there's a bunch of question marks naturally from his like past. So it balances itself out. It's such an interesting comparison. I'd say to close the case, do with this what you will, as you say, Kevin. Personally speaking, like I stand with Roman Reigns, damn it, pal. But comparing the two, it's always tough. It really is.
Yeah, it's a tough comparison. It's really one that you can't win. Because if you're looking at this like just, oh, straight up in ring, who's the better wrestler? I mean, you could argue Kenny Omega is. He probably is the better technician. You know, he is the better technician.
He can execute moves better than Roman can. But that comes down to how much value you put in that. So it's, you know.
Yeah, because like, what else are we arguing here? That's really the only argument that you can make between the two. If you're having like a real debate, because you can't debate promo skills. Like nobody with a mind, like in their right mind, is gonna be like, oh, Kenny Omega's a better promo. And you can't debate star power. You can't debate merchandise sales. You can't debate any of that stuff because Roman has the backing of the E, pal. So the only real thing that you can debate between the two is the in-ring work. That's pretty much it. And it's not a real sport, so it's not as like black and white as saying, oh, who's better, LeBron or Carmelo Anthony. It's just it doesn't work that way, you know?
Yeah, it's just they're very different. To one audience, Omega is like everything they adore. Like he's the great in-ring guy he doesn't focus on that corny, cringe entertainment stuff, but he's the in-ring worker who we love. And yet to another audience, because of that, Omega sucks and he can't do anything outside of the ring. He's useless and etc. So these two respectively personify everything about your smarks versus anti-smarks, your pro wrestling versus sports entertainment. It's a fascinating comparison. Hopefully this video helped with, I don't know, making you think about the legacies and all this kind of stuff. Kevin, any closing words?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. You know, we'll talk to you guys on the next video.